three dimensions of impact that we think at Rishihood: a Vyakti Nirman, a Vichar Nirman, and a Vyavastha Nirman. One interesting thing when we say about institutions, we think of Vyakti Nirman particularly in classrooms, but that is not so. Probably about 30-40% of the student time is only spent in classrooms. Bulk of it is outside the classroom, and somehow that is not in our focus. One thing that we want to do perhaps in a few years from now is make a model pilot successful experiment that can serve as a template for others to follow. So we're developing a lot of model curricula. We're working on very innovative ways of teaching. And if these experiments are successful, sure, some of them will succeed, some of them will fail, but if they start distilling and becoming good, then they can serve as models which we would definitely want to share with other institutions out there who can use this and do similar experiments in their respective institutions. Thank you for inviting me over. Rishi University is also proud to be a partner for this conference, and I thank Subroto ji and everyone else involved in giving us this opportunity. So, taking a break from what we were discussing in the previous session, I think something that is very important and all of us very well acknowledge and know is that the importance of institutions. So, conferences, thought building, all this eventually happens in institutional setups like where we are in a very prestigious institution today. So, how do we do this? And particularly from our context, understanding its need today, what are the challenges, and what Rishihood is trying to do in establishing a new academic institution not too far from here in a place called Sonipat, about 50 kilometers from here. So, I'll be sharing some of those experiences. Um, Broadly, I'll talk about institutions, their landscape, importance of educational institutions, which we all know about, and then what is Rishihood trying to do. I'll keep it brief. I'll keep it for about 20-25 minutes, and then I can take a few questions. So I request all your kind attention. So let's begin with institutions. We all know they're all around us. We can see the family or the community, we call them as institutions. The state, again, being in the national capital, we recognize it very well, its impact. The markets, the firms, and political parties. Broadly, these are what we would call institutions. But something that is missing there are educational institutions. So, despite all discussion about a civilizational renaissance that we have, we all know that eventually we are here. If we say that we have been the cradle of civilization and we have lasted for millennia, it is primarily to something called the Guru Shishya Parampara, is also an institution. So, what does it mean in today's context? So, this transfer of knowledge, generation over generation, that mandate eventually is still with academic institutions. So somehow we cannot ignore, if we have to see a vibrant civilization, it has to be coming out of academic institutions. That has to be recognized, the importance of that, it cannot be ignored. And educational institutions have been fulfilling that need for millennia and will continue to be there, despite many different forms of where we can transfer knowledge, we can do many other ways, but still a live transfer of knowledge, a live transfer of consciousness only happens in the presence of masters, and that is within academic institutions. So that is where was also my realization, because I was not of this opinion a few years back. But understanding India, understanding its challenges, understanding why we are where we are, I started to appreciate the importance of building academic institutions, and that's very, very important. And that's also the attempt at Rishihood. So, educational institutions are not just another institution. In fact, they are the central institution in many ways, because what comes out of educational institutions is not just the people who go to different institutions, the ideas that animate all institutions eventually come from academic institutions or educational institutions. So we should be very, very cognizant of this fact that we cannot ignore them. We can build great political parties, we can build very strong, robust markets, firms, family, or the state, but without having a strong academic institution to support all of them, or a network of academic institutions, or an ecosystem of academic institutions, we will not be able to influence them. So this is a very important slide that I request all my colleagues here to pay attention to, that this is very, very important and we'll have to pay focus on this In more recent times, we have tried to build some interventions here that we are starting. I can see Dr. Joy Sen here. We are starting some centers in academic institutions on IKS. We are building some think tanks on this, but all of them eventually have to be hosted in academic institutions to be able to influence all of this. So that's also very important, the centrality of academic institutions. So in some ways, we say that educational institutions shape civilizations. It has been so for long. It continues to be there. At Rishihood, what we call this in that sense is we call it Vyakti, Vichar, and Vyavastha. So you can hold on to this thought. I'll elaborate on it further. But this is the triple level of impact that educational institutions have. It's on people, it's on thought, it's on systems. So just zooming out and looking at broadly educational institutions in India or even in the globe, right? So I know it's a simplistic representation, but it is gives you a sense of where it is, right? So if you take it as there is two axes, one is on the economic axis where you can call it the left or the right, and there is a religious slash a cultural axis, broadly divided on theological basis here, the Christian or the Islamic or the Western thought. Most academic institutions fall into these three brackets, as you can see here. Most professional degree giving institutions, MBA, engineering is on the economic right, broadly driven by the Western ideas. So that's where we are. Mostly, if you see humanities, social sciences, liberal arts, all this is on the economic left, and it could be divided theologically either on the Christian or on the Islamic axis. So this is where we are. I will not name institutions, but we all know. And it is not a judgment on either of them. It is just the way thoughts or ideologies are shaping institutions, and in turn they influence and build this thought. This is the broad framework of how academic institutions are spread out in the country and even in the globe. Now, when we think of building a new academic institution, and that is important because, as I've said, that is the central institution that we all have to focus on, it is natural that when we start something, we'll eventually end up being on this landscape. But then, does that suffice? Because we'll be most likely professing those ideas. So, how do we build an Indic or a Dharmic or a Bharatiya academic institution? Does it lie in this axis or it's completely different? So, our result of our thinking and brainstorming at Rishihood is it's a completely different axis on which we have to think of building an Indic academic institution. We can't be falling into these binaries. That's easier said than done because a lot of thought building has to happen of what genuinely is a Bharatiya thought. How does it profess ideas on different axes that we see here? What would be its founding principles? So it's a very new challenge, and we have not faced this challenge for long. So we need an Indic educational institution, higher educational institution particularly. And it's a difficult problem to solve because you need to be grounded, rooted in the Bharatiya thought. Yet you cannot be inward looking because we want to be influencing the globe. We want to learn from what's happening in the best of the academic institutions or what's happening in the world. So you cannot be inward looking. In fact, you should be actively engaging with the rest of the world. Easier said than done because most likely when we start institutions like this, we become very inward looking and we are just battling the thoughts happening internally. But as we do that, we also have to engage globally. That's important. Many a times when we build institutions like this, it may happen that they become unaffordable or inaccessible to people. So they have to be accessible. At the same time, they also have to be high quality. Right? We cannot be compromising on quality. We want to compete with the best in the world. We want to compete with the best in India. So they have to be having a high quality institution as well. But while doing that, it should not become a very elite institution in that sense where people cannot access it. So it's again a dilemma or a binary that we have to battle and settle in between. And the curriculum, we talk about liberal arts, which is very multidisciplinary. We talk broadly that if you look at the Gurukul system or the traditional Indian knowledge, it has always been multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, right? But today, the needs of society as well as the industry probably is also looking for specialists. So how do we develop specialists as well as give them this whole holistic education or a multidisciplinary education? Again, a challenge because you have a limited time of 3 to 4 years in which you have to do this. Um, this problem is not very well solved. I mean, we'll have to appreciate this as institution builders that we can speak about it. I can put it on a slide as just three different challenges that we are trying to address, but each of them is a constant battle within when we are building this institution, because the more we go towards our traditional knowledge and we start looking more at our Indian core, it may naturally happen that we start dismissing what's happening globally. The more we try to get build big infrastructure, good infrastructure, hire excellent faculty, it may very soon happen that it becomes inaccessible to many people, and that's happening in India as well. If you look at the private universities, some of them who claim to be very, in that sense, high quality, have become very elite institutions and beyond the reach of the common man. And it's an easy problem to solve when you say you are liberal arts, but then you know what it comes along with. So what happens is it enough for young people to be able to find worthwhile careers which will fulfill their aspirations while you are also very multidisciplinary? So this is a challenge. This is what we are working at and trying to address this. I'll come to what we are trying to do. So broadly we call Rishihood University, we are too new. This institution where we are standing is about 5 decades plus old. We are just 2.5 years old. We call India's first impact university. We are very conscious when we say it's an impact university because academic institutions have in some ways been disconnected from society's needs, the state's needs. They have become silos of their own. Like while we are sitting at IIT, just neighboring Munirka village probably doesn't know what's happening here. We don't know what's happening in those villages close to this place, right? So this is a constant battle. We have built silos of academic institutions that deliberate internally and serve the people within, but then we want to consciously have Rishihood University as a impact university, and I'll talk about what impact that we mean, but it is a very different approach to education that we're trying to take there. So again, revising, and I just told you about three dimensions of impact that we think at Rishihood: a Vyakti Nirman, a Vichar Nirman, and a Vyavastha Nirman. So most academic institutions today, at least in India, are focused on giving good quality education. However, we want to define good quality. That is primarily giving good education and then helping them get jobs. Very few are focused on research. That is more of the thought building. So how do we infuse ideas into other institutions around us? And most importantly, how do we impact systems? So how does what happen in our academic institutions help in building the state? For example, if we are here in the national capital, how does the academic research here, how do the people who graduate out of here help in impacting the state and its systems? So can we imagine that our students, because we are all talking about education here, perhaps 20 years from now would be a part of the national education policy that would be drafted perhaps again in a few years time from now? Can we imagine our faculty, our students should be a part of that? Can we rethink on how we are going to set up our, for example, the healthcare system, which is a huge crisis in the country currently, or the agriculture system, which all of us are in the winters of Delhi are suffering from? So how do we constantly think that we are not inward looking, we are not just training students, but we are developing thought that is going to impact or animate other institutions, and eventually how do we impact the state, is the broad idea of Rishihood. So we call it Vyakti, Vichar, and Vyavastha. So it's a, I know it may seem like this is very lofty idea. How do you make it possible? We are aware of that. So we'll have to take small steps in this direction. And as we all know, institutions take decades to get built. But unless we have the right vision in place in year zero, we'll not be able to make it. So at least that is for sure, that we'll have to at least have a big vision in mind. So when you say Vyakti Nirman, what are we doing at Rishihood? And when I say Rishihood, I just don't want to say it's about, I think how we have to start imagining institutions in future. I want to just share a template of what we are doing. Of course, you need highly inspired and rooted faculty because faculty are the lifeblood of institutions. So how do we identify them? Natural challenge, that how do we get faculty when the faculty themselves whom we are hiring are from institutions that I have shown you earlier, are from typical institutions that have a different worldview of their own. So we'll have to find faculty who are world class as well as highly inspired and are willing to contribute to building an institution like this. That's a constant challenge. One interesting thing when we say about institutions, we think of Vyakti Nirman particularly in classrooms, but that is not so. Probably about 30-40% of the student time is only spent in classrooms. Bulk of it is outside the classroom. And somehow that is not in our focus. So how do we build a conducive environment that is living and learning together, for example? So one thing at Rishihood that we have tried to do, and we have done it now, is 100% residential campus, a mandatorily residential campus. It's not easy for young institutions to enforce this, because once you do a residential campus, naturally the costs of education go up, and then you will have a lesser student intake. But we are insisting on it because we know that education primarily happens outside the classroom. So we instituted something called a Dean of Culture, and he'll be here tomorrow morning. His name is Dr. Sampadan Mishra. He will share the ideas. So I'm just saying that this is very important, that we will have a Dean Student Welfare, we'll have a Dean's Student Affairs, but we don't actually look at campus culture itself as a very important role that somebody has to play. That's something we have. We have a lot of audit courses that happen through because once you have a residential campus, right from morning 6 a.m., all of our students are here. So right from morning 6 a.m. to night 10 p.m., they're all at a very rigorous daily schedule. So it has various elements of sports, music, yoga, martial arts, different things that we want to incorporate. So that naturally the education, the dimensions expand a lot. So we can use perhaps 16, 18 hours of the day in doing different things. We want it to be a student-driven campus again. Not see institutions very soon become too bureaucratic, become too over administered, over managed. All of us have been victims of that, so we know that very well. But can you genuinely pass on the leadership back to the students and ask them to drive the campus? I've had some experiences traveling globally where I've seen such campuses, particularly in Japan, where I felt that there can be campuses that are actually driven by the students themselves, because eventually if you want to create leaders, once they go out in society, they'll have to lead other institutions. So why not start leading the institution where you're studying? So each of these students here is given a responsibility of leading a bunch of students and taking responsibilities on campus. So we want to keep the bureaucracy very, very thin on campus. Of course, fully vegetarian campus, but of course high quality, and we want to make it nutritious as well, in sync with the diets, preferences, and what will help and aid in our learning. And very importantly, very interesting, I was about 6 months back at Yale University, a very, very senior faculty there. So we were discussing the idea of Rishihood with him. What was very fascinating to them is a new university is coming up in India, because it was difficult to imagine them what Yale would have looked like 300, 400 years back. So I asked him, okay, after your entire academic career of maybe 5 decades plus, what is one thing that you would want to change if you had an option to restart your career? So his answer was very, very interesting. He said somehow universities have assumed that their role is to teach only between the years 17 to 21 or 25 at best. We have focused on learning only at this brief time. But learning is genuinely lifelong, and universities are not serving that purpose. So how can we imagine something for lifelong learning? So we have something for a center for lifelong learning, because our mandate as universities is to aid learning throughout your life. So how can we start rethinking universities to serve that purpose? Okay. Moving on to which are broadly producing ideas that influence thought. So what we don't see Rishihood as the way that can solve or address all the challenges ourselves. We definitely are looking for collaborations, and we are actively collaborating. But one thing that we want to do perhaps in a few years from now is make a model pilot successful experiment that can serve as a template for others to follow. So we're developing a lot of model curricula. We're working on very innovative ways of teaching. And if these experiments are successful, sure, some of them will succeed, some of them will fail. But if they start distilling and becoming good, then they can serve as models which we would definitely want to share with other institutions out there who can use this and do similar experiments in their respective institutions. One thing that we want to do perhaps in a few years from now is make a model pilot successful experiment that can serve as a template for others to follow. So we're developing a lot of model curricula. We're working on very innovative ways of teaching. And if these experiments are successful, sure, some of them will succeed, some of them will fail. But if they start distilling and becoming good, then they can serve as models which we would definitely want to share with other institutions out there who can use this and do similar experiments in their respective institutions. We have a center for human sciences. We have talked about natural sciences, social sciences, different types of sciences, but somehow India definitely needs something like human sciences, and we have a huge knowledge tradition around it. So how do we rethink and go back and build sciences which are based on human. And then when we do a lot of research on Indian knowledge systems, particularly from Sri Aurobindo's thought, the person who leads this is the same Dean Culture. His name is Dr. Sampananda Mishra. He heads the Center for Human Sciences that influences the curriculum at Rishihood. Of course, we have a research cell. Again, research is a big question. All of us here who are academics will appreciate this, that somehow research has become completely going in a different direction altogether. But it has become a very different pursuit. It has not gone back and served society or its needs very well. And we all recognize this, right? With predatory journals, with different forms of publications happening there, we are finally looking more on publications, its count, and not as much about actually are we producing thought that shape society and civilization. So, can we build a new research culture which is inspired by the needs of the community or the country and in turn serves them? So, very different way to motivate research than just number of publications or the quality of the journals where it's published, which is important, but it's not sufficient in that sense, right? Um, Broadly tried to put out different dimensions at which we are trying to do some work. It's still early stage. These are difficult challenges. We should all recognize this, that, and we know that for perhaps decades or centuries we have not built institutions that we can truly call are grounded in our philosophy or the Bharatiya thought that is like mentioned here. So on many different dimensions, we are just borrowing frameworks that have worked very well. So the template would still be a Harvard or an Oxford many places, right? But then how do we rethink curriculum? How do we rethink textbooks? How do we rethink our reference books that we give? How do we rethink pedagogy? How do we rethink evaluation, right? And how do, I mean, these are all new questions. I mean, it's a tremendous areas of research and possibly PhDs out there where what do we do with the different ranking systems, right? Somebody recently just asked me, oh, would Rishi would be going for rankings? What if you do this, you would not be in the rankings anywhere? Would you get NAC accreditation? So all these things are true. They're all out there. But how do we rethink? How do we develop something very different? If we have to think originally from our perspective, how do we do this? How do we build the right benchmarks for quality? Um, when we think of education is only the intellect, can we think of the 5 koshas that we have? How do we develop each of them? How does our curriculum aid them? A lot of open-ended questions, but at least we should start asking those questions and slowly trying to infuse our ideas into them, because that is when genuinely an institution would be in that sense Bharatiya or Indic, because otherwise we would be just offering a few electives, a few courses, a few seminars, which is all good, but it is not in that sense going to complete the picture, because all of them work together. They would reinforce each other. So that is the big focus on the Vichar Nirman aspect. On Vyavastha, which is systems and institutions, how do we engage or influence them? Very well established institutions are out there, and I can take a few names here which are working with government, and it's glad to see that the government is also reaching out to us. But that's very important. We cannot ignore that, because eventually scale comes by engaging with the system, with the policymakers, with the state. That, we like it or not, is still a huge force of impact. So we will have to work with them. We will have to work with the community that is around us. Right? We cannot be disconnected. We don't want to build. For a very interesting statistic is perhaps Sonipat, where Rishihood is located today, is India's largest education hub. It has about 11 universities in an area of 10 square kilometer. That is the density of the intellectual capital there. But Sonipat is not in the national news anywhere. Nobody cares. It is a poor suburb of Delhi. Why have these 11 universities there not been able to make an impact? It should be probably like a Silicon Valley, right? That it should be doing something in that very different dimension when such high intellectual capital is there, including an IIT Delhi campus, satellite campus is there. So that's there. Then we have to engage. Universities typically don't talk to each other. How do we talk to each other? How do we exchange curricula? How do we train our each other's faculty? How do we share research? How do we do joint collaborations? So we'll have to work on that aspect. Capacity building programs for schools. And one interesting experiment that we are trying is we are engaging with Gurukuls, because Gurukuls typically are up to the standard of 10th, and then we have to, in that sense, in the age group. But then what happens next? These are unanswered questions. So we're looking at that. There are few critical success factors that we have identified. That is building, of course, a core faculty, a core leadership team that is committed to Rishihood, that is committed to institution building. Typically, faculty are of the perspective that we want to teach, right? But then when you join institutions like Rishihood, you'll also have to be institution builders, lot of administrative work, lot of uncertainty, lot of chaos. How do we handle that? We are not trained during our PhDs to be able to handle all this. Then a quality student cohort, how do we convince young students to come to a new place, take the risk? How do we build financial sustainability? It's not easy when you have to have huge infrastructure according to the UGC regulations or the Private Universities Act regulations. How do you build huge infrastructure yet be financially sustainable? Who are the philanthropists who are willing to contribute to building institutions? Not too many out there. A brand, and finally a very transformative student experience. I'll close with this slide, that we want an education. This is Swamiji's thought, and the word Rishihood has come from Swamiji. Nobody else has used this word before this. That he himself says that this is what, when we say that education can produce such type of people, he calls them having reached the state of being a rishi, or in the state of being a rishihood. So that's where the word rishihood comes from. He's been our guiding civilizational icon, and that's the inspiration that drives us every day. Thank you.